It didn't have to be this way. Nothing ever does. After Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, Israel was always going to retaliate. No nation-state would or should shrug off what was, by any reasonable measure, an act of war. But Israel, specifically Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, had options nevertheless. Hamas were not going anywhere because they could not go anywhere. A horrified world was more sympathetic to Israel's general position than perhaps at any point since the Six-Day War of 1967. Though Netanyahu, in his approach to Palestinians, has always resembled the proverbial man to whom everything looks like a nail, he did not have to reach immediately for the hammer. A little over 2 years later, there are hopes that the war Israel launched on several fronts after October 7th might be at the beginning of its end. Israel and Hamas have agreed terms on a ceasefire, a phased withdrawal of Israeli troops, an influx of aid to the Gaza Strip, and the exchange of the 20 living hostages still held by Hamas for nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees held by Israel. But there were other paths to this destination, which might have been shorter and might not have taken such a toll of Palestinian lives or on the reputation of Israel in general and its Prime Minister in particular. What other choices might Netanyahu have made? What would Israeli voters have gone along with? And if the war had to be fought, did it have to be fought like that? This is the Foreign Desk.
Total victory is not a military plan. It cannot be a governmental objective.
The irony of all ironies, that Netanyahu actually accelerated recognition Palestinian state more than any lefty leader in Israeli history.
I see zero utility in just killing civilians, thinking that somehow that's going to put pressure on the enemy to surrender.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Ksenia Svetlova, Executive Director of ROPES, the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics and Security, and a former member of the Israeli Knesset from 2015 to 2019. She joins us from Modi'in. Ksenia, let's go back to about 2 years ago. Did Benjamin Netanyahu or anybody else who might have been Prime Minister of Israel at the time have any realistic options that weren't an immediate large-scale military strike on Gaza?
Well, I have a hard time imagining that anybody else, Netanyahu or another prime minister, be it Naftali Bennett or Yair Lapid or anybody else, could escape or avoid large-scale war on Gaza, because Israel was surprised by Hamas. It was caught off without its pants. And what it found out, that the military machine of Hamas was much larger and more extensive than anything that Israelis ever imagined. So this kind of unbelievable attack that took place by 10/7, it did require a root treatment of Hamas military capabilities. But, this is something that, I think that most of Israelis agree that it was supposed to happen. But for a war to last 2 years, I assure you that nobody, absolutely no one, perhaps apart from Prime Minister's close aides, thought back then that the war would last for 2 unbelievable long years.
I'll come back to how the war has tracked over that 2 years, but going back to those very early days and very early hours after the attack, I'm sure you're right in saying that any Israeli prime minister and probably the prime minister of any country would have sought to retaliate in such circumstances. But was there any discussion, or would there have been any argument at the time for maybe a council of restraint which would have kept Israel on the moral high ground, would have kept international sympathy behind it? I mean, this is kind of what US President Joe Biden was advocating at the time.
Yes, absolutely. But I think that Israel, while fighting Hamas, and I have to remind that so apart from the attack of 10/7, the missiles that landed here in Israel, the amount was just unprecedented. On 10/7, on the day after, and for many, many days after that. So it was much more. It was a coordinated attack on Israel, not only on the border communities, not only the kidnappings, it was the whole deal. It was a war. The war was started by Hamas. And Israel still had its sympathies, while it was clear that it is trying to achieve some necessary military goals. But these goals were achieved long time ago. And I think that by January of 2024, there was a feeling that the international time for this war is running out already. It was January, end of January of 2024. And by then already, we had many different plans on the table of involvement of international peacekeeping force. I remember writing by myself, one of these researchers that landed on the table of the decision makers. And I had some conversations with, heads of states and ministers and diplomats that assured that this is something that they indeed do consider to help Israel, to help the Palestinians, to stop this war and to provide for security. This was unprecedented. We never heard of this before. Yet, these kind of scenarios were never discussed. They were not discussed in the beginning of war for obvious reasons. Israel was at war, but also when most of the military goals were indeed realized. Even back then, I do not recall one meeting of Israeli government that was dedicated to these diplomatic options, continuation of the war, but by non-military means. So today, when we will have the negotiation teams discussing the day after, this is unprecedented indeed, because the Israeli government did not allocate any time, any opportunity for discussing of these options.
Let's go back to that timeline. You mentioned the idea that by January 2024, so after 3 months of fairly hectic military operations in Gaza, Israel announces that most of its war aims have been realized, that Hamas has been substantially incapacitated. If that's what had happened, if Israel had stopped major military operations at that point and begun engaging in some of those processes you mentioned, what do you think the scenario might look like now?
Well, we will never know. First of all, it's just assumptions. So, as historians, I think it's important to understand that we could never know what would happen, and would Hamas indeed agree to that? Because while Sinwar was still alive and they still had hope that perhaps the axis of Iranian resistance bloc will, come to their aid in a more significant way than they did in the end. So we don't know that. But I do believe that even by stating that this is our objective as a state of Israel, we want peace. We do not want, and we completely negate the opportunity of this endless war. I think that even by basically outlining this kind of plan as an option, as an opportunity, as something that Israel indeed wishes to promote, with Palestinians, without Hamas, yes, with the involvement of, Arab and the international community and so on. I think that even then, Israel's conditions, Israel's situation would be much better in the world, because what we heard repeatedly from the ministers of the cabinet, from the members of the coalition, that they are indeed interested in forever war, in more settlements, and in this absurd term of the total victory, whatever does it mean. Or victory, how? Over whom? How do you practically see it? Total victory is not a military plan. It cannot be a governmental objective. So I think that basically the Israeli government, Netanyahu's government, deteriorated the already problematic conditions of Israel by outlining a very grim future for Israelis and for Palestinians.
One of the other wider decisions that Israel's government made, of course, during those last 2 years was to widen the war to neutralize, as it would see it, Israel's other actual and potential foes in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran. Netanyahu's argument has always been that those actions have made Israel safer than it was 2 years ago. So, again, if we stand that one on its head a bit, and Israel decides not to take those wider actions and to limit itself merely to Gaza, do those other organizations and entities still pose the same kind of threat? Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, even Assad, were he still in position. Is there at least an argument that those actions by Israel have ensured its own security?
Well, first of all, a gentle reminder, these actors invited themselves into a battlefield. Nobody forced Hezbollah to go and to start shelling borderline communities and northern communities up to Haifa and deeper into Israel by 10/7. That's, what they decided to do. And they basically invited themselves into this circle of hostilities. I think that Israel, if they would not attempt, these attacks at the time, Israel would focus on Hamas, on Gaza. And I'm absolutely sure that nothing of the kind of the operations that we saw against Hezbollah would be initiated by Israel if Hezbollah would not attack Israel by itself. But what's done is done. I think that Israel is indeed safer today because Hezbollah is weakened indeed. And we were living in the shadow of 150,000 Hezbollah rockets. For me as an Israeli, knowing today that this organization was substantially weakened, that makes me and many more Israelis feel more safe. But at the same time, while all of these unbelievable things took place, and I'm speaking specifically about the change of the regime in Syria, because frankly, I do not think that the Israeli government meant for this to happen. And from what we know, it actually was still engaged in some kind of negotiations with Assad till the very last days before his regime just dissolved. And yet I think it's a positive development. It's a positive development for the whole region, of course. First of all, for the Syrians, but also for us in Israel. But on top of that, we will only be safe when our government will find time and desire to address the most acute problem. And this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Netanyahu was, he attempted to convince the whole of Israel that it's okay, we can have peace agreements with the Abraham Accord countries and, with UAE, perhaps with Saudi Arabia. And the Palestinian issue, it's not important anymore. It's off the table. So everything that happened since 10/7, I think it's a proof. More than just a proof. It's here, it's in his face. The Palestinian issue is stronger than ever today. It mobilizes millions of people across the world. And I think that right now, Israel has yet to deal, with something that it avoided to deal with since 1967. What will be the future of the occupied territories? What will be the future of our relations with the Palestinians? What Israel actually wishes to see? So this government, but also every other government, except perhaps of Rabin's, didn't want to answer this question, frankly.
Just a final thought on that. Is that arguable? Do you think, again, looking back over these 2 years, that there was a missed opportunity by the Israeli government that at some point, if, as you suggested, military operations in Gaza had concluded earlier, that they could have framed it in a way that made it clear we're not rewarding Hamas here, we're not rewarding terrorism, but it is in everybody's interests to revive some sort of peace process, some sort of path towards a two-state solution. Is that a chance that Netanyahu perhaps might regret not seizing?
Netanyahu, he's a leader who during many, many years changed his opinions and his ideals and his goals for Israel according to his political needs. So I don't know what he might say in the future in order to safeguard perhaps his political power, and so on. But he definitely failed. He failed Israel. He failed Israel, he failed hostages, he failed their families, he failed everyone who wishes to see peace in this land and end of conflict with the Palestinians by running away from various deals that could end this war earlier. I'm absolutely unsure that, that by striking a deal with Hamas, he also needed to stop the war with Hezbollah, for example. It could go, could go on at the same time because it was something that was at that point already unrelated. But by declining these deals and running away from them, and his ministers are proud of sabotaging these deals, he must pay the price for that. This is something that it's inevitable. This war lasted for such a long time because the Prime Minister of Israel at a certain point decided to prolong it artificially for his political needs. That's it. And everything else that could happen, of course, like the saving of lives of the Israelis and the Palestinians. This is first. But then opportunities, to strengthen the moderates. I think that, we could be in a different place today. It would be very, very difficult today to, consolidate this camp of the moderates. Because, yes, the war radicalizes people on both sides. And for that, I don't think that, I don't know if he will be regretting the decisions that he took. Perhaps some of them, perhaps the strike on Doha, that's quite certain. But as for missed opportunities for peace, he's a political animal. I don't think that he's sorry about anything. But if it safeguarded his political survival, then, it was the right decision for him. It was a wrong decision for our country.
That was Ksenia Svetlova, Executive Director of ROPES, the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics and Security, and a former member of the Israeli Knesset. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Our next guest is Yossi Meckelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Yossi, let's return to those days immediately following October 7th, 2023. It's fairly clear what the mood of Israel's government was, but was that reflected among the Israeli public? Were Israeli people as angry and vengeful?
I believe so, yeah. I think the trauma of October 7 was immense. It's a combination of trauma and shock. Shock from the fact that actually Hamas was capable so quickly penetrate into Israel, and almost with there was resistance, but one that enabled them to go into civil communities and commit the massacre that they did. And it's created also, the trauma and ongoing that actually how vulnerable is the Israeli society. Bear in mind, that the fence that was built, the barrier there, was the most expensive barrier in the world. And with all the technology and the assumption that no one could cross this without the Israeli military stop it. And within hours, it was not there. And from the disarray among the IDF, not even knowing exactly what happened. So I think this is not only then. I think many Israelis are still in October 7, 2023. Psychologically, never, despite all what has been done since then, they are still in the trauma there. And of course, this is dangerous. On the one hand, you have the government in shock, but also try to redeem itself by using excessive force and going into war, which is as much about revenge as eliminating Hamas or bringing the hostages back.
But when the Israeli government, the Israeli military embarked on what was going to be obviously a fairly severe response early on, just to be clear, you think probably that's where Israeli public opinion was, that hit them fast, hit them hard, and keep hitting them?
Completely. And not only that, is the notions that all Gazan people are complicit at what happened in October 7. And that's the president said, and he's not the executive, and many people, ordinary people, I remember talking to people then said, no, basically the idea there are no innocent people in Gaza. Part of it has to do with the fact that people still remember that they voted for Hamas all these years back, and part of it because there were civilians that followed Hamas and entered into these communities and help with taking hostages or help themselves, whatever were in the houses in these communities. So it was a combination. And real anger. The mood in the street was of real anger. And wanting, even if people said, now we're going to, after Hamas, there was a strong sense of revenge. Not surprisingly, when President Biden was in Israel, a few days later, he warned Israel, learn from our mistake after 9/11. One, don't look for revenge, and B, remember the democracy don't fight like terrorist groups. Unfortunately, they didn't heed to this good advice.
But even supposing Benjamin Netanyahu or whichever Israeli prime minister had wanted to do something different at the time, if they had decided that the course would have been perhaps to listen to President Biden and act with a bit more judgment and a bit more restraint, would the Israeli public have tolerated that? Would they actually have been able to go to the Israeli people and say, look, let's not be hasty about this, and also we are better than this and we need to act like it?
I think so. Had there been a leadership, a considered leadership with the ability to think strategically, they would say, we don't have to go immediately. And definitely we should fight differently, because here are the strategic objectives that we set. I can put a completely alternative scenario, what has happened in the last 2 years, that actually serves the right in Israel, not the left in Israel. Because, look, had they gone only after Hamas, we've been considered to humanitarian issues, make sure that there is no hunger and minimum civilians are killed, and just take their time, probably the issue of Palestinian state would have been removed after what happened on October 7, removed off the table, the international table, for years to come, probably a generation. I'm not saying that's what I would like to say. But because of the magnitude of what happened there, and they could have said, you see, we left Gaza, the same kind of rhetoric, we left Gaza and see what happened. They come and they massacre our own people. The minute that they didn't take this advice from Biden or from others, they actually set in motion what we see now, that Israel is isolated. And the irony of all ironies, that Netanyahu actually accelerated recognition Palestinian state more than any lefty leader in Israeli history.
But if we think back 2 years ago, and if it is likely, and probably understandably so, that the Israeli public and the Israeli government were of one mind in terms of their anger, their fear, their desire for vengeance, etc., was there a point at which that changed, and perhaps changed enough that Benjamin Netanyahu or whoever was running Israel might have been able to say, that's enough, we've made our point, and now we need to think about the future? And if there was a point of that sort, when do you think it was?
I think actually from the beginning, within few weeks after the military operation started, and some of the leaders of Hamas were targeted, so they could at a certain point to say, we hit them enough. And first and foremost, because, from the beginning, most of the population in Israel wanted their hostages back. This is something that runs so deep. You have two competing almost aspects here. One, the deep-seated fear in Israeli society that goes even generation before Israel was established, of fear of the other and the idea that everyone is out there to get them. And then something like this happens, and of course it enhances this feeling. But at the same time, the ethos, the covenant in Israel between the government, the state, and soldiers, and the soldiers' families, that if anyone becomes captive, the government will do anything to release them. And there you have, at this point, more than 200, 250 hostages. And the government was very slow to react. And even we know that there were opportunities to reach a deal, to release the hostages, and even now, they're still there. So I think at a certain point, between the different objectives, Netanyahu could have exchanged between keep the war and keep hitting harder Gaza to say, but we get most of the hostages back, or Hamas is weak enough for us to park a two-state solution. But he was under the influence of the extreme right wing in his government. And they won't stop, because even not now, they won't stop until Hamas, whatever it means, totally defeated. And they will take even few steps further until there are no Gazan or Palestinians in Gaza.
You mentioned earlier, just finally, the idea of a Palestinian state and how the way that Netanyahu has conducted this war has probably done a fair bit to revive the idea. But again, if we frame this in terms of where Israeli public opinion was. Has there been a point in the last 2 years? Because obviously after October 7th, all the polling about whether Israelis favour a two-state solution showed that it had declined markedly, and in the circumstances, that's probably understandable. But has there been any point in the last 2 years at which an Israeli Prime Minister, be it Netanyahu or someone else, could have said, seriously, we do need to talk about this. We do need to find a way to establish a Palestinian state because it is the best chance that this doesn't happen again, because obviously there's two sales pitches that have to go on there. First, an idea for a Palestinian state has to be sold to an Israeli government, and then that Israeli government has to sell it to the Israeli people.
That's absolutely correct. I don't think in the last 2 years, and definitely a government like the government, this is the sixth Netanyahu government, has it with itself to try even to have this, to open this conversation about a two-state solution. It's not there. You needed a different government to open this conversation. I think again, I mentioned that most Israelis are still in October 7, 2 years ago. This is not something that is susceptible or conducive to a conversation about a two-state solution. For this, you first need to end the war, the hostages back. We need also to create the space for reflection. Israel got from the point that the sympathy of the world, empathy was with Israel, and it lost it almost completely. And this is what happened. You had stages during this war that a deal could have been struck with Hamas that would have made it way easier. Now, even if we go back to the discussion of a two-state solution, it's feels imposed from the outside. And this never a good position to be. Instead, it's happening organically from within, because you understand that what the military can achieve for you reached its end, and now you have to translate military achievements into political objectives. But this is not the current government in Israel. They don't have strategic thinking.
That was Yossi Meckelberg, a senior consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. This is the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, and joining me finally is the retired U.S. Army officer Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe. General Hodges also commanded a brigade of the 101st Airborne Division at the Battle of Najaf in 2003, among other engagements. General, if we think back to 2 years ago, if you look at the challenge that would have been presented to the Israel Defense Forces where Gaza was concerned, did it strike you as anything similar to what you might have been looking at when you prepared for Najaf in Iraq, for example, or any of the other urban combat you took part in?
I think I was surprised at the level of violence and destruction that was meted out by the Israeli Defense Force. Certainly, everybody from Hamas that was killed deserved to be killed, but the tens of thousands of civilians that were lost as collateral damage, if you will, was not something that the U.S. Army or the British Army or any of the rest of us would have tolerated or felt comfortable with. So that's something that I think we're going to have to look at, and I imagine that the Israeli Defense Force also is going to be looking at for some time.
Because by way of comparison, what were your rules of engagement when operating in a built-up urban environment? Yeah,
and I want to be clear. We certainly made mistakes, so I don't want to claim that somehow, but it was rules of engagement were always, number one, an American soldier can always protect himself. You can always do that. That's never been taken away from us. But there was an expectation that you would do everything possible to avoid civilian casualties. And as the war progressed, we worked very hard to make sure that we had positive identification before you used lethal force. Not always possible. If you're receiving fire from a building, you would shoot back at that building, which we certainly did, but you would not drop a JDAM on it, for example, without knowing or feeling confident about who was inside that building. And I have no problem with rules of engagement. Rules of engagement help the commander, actually. Some people get frustrated. They call it, they're burdensome or a hindrance. But if you go back to the purpose of the operation, what are you doing there? I mean, you don't destroy enemy just for the sake of destroying enemy. You're trying to accomplish a purpose. And in our cases in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was to eventually protect the local people and enable them to have their own government. So rules of engagement help in that regard. And then more broadly, they help make sure that we are operating in compliance with the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict.
So is there a self-interested logic to following rules of engagement, i.e. that if you don't follow them and there is an excess of civilian casualties, then that's ultimately detrimental to what you're trying to accomplish?
That's exactly it. That's why I was, as I was watching the fighting get started after October the 7th, and again, Israel, of course, has the right to defend itself. Everybody in Hamas should burn in hell forever. But when I heard Prime Minister Netanyahu say that the mission was destroy Hamas, I thought, okay, you can't just destroy an insurgency or an idea like that. You have to address the causes. Why is there Hamas? And I think I listened to former Israeli Prime Minister Omer speak the other day, and he said if they killed every single member of Hamas, every one of them, you still would have tens of thousands of Palestinians that would have experienced, seen all this happening, and that they would have been changed or converted to being a supporter or wanting to join Hamas or something like it themselves. So I don't like this hearts and minds thing, but it is about protecting population and killing only those that must be killed.
I mean, that's a half answer to the next question I wanted to ask. Was in this particular circumstance, did it strike you that there was any option for any kind of hearts and minds enterprise of the kind which often accompanies counterinsurgency operations? You're trying to make it clear to the locals that you're better off with us than you are with the other mob. Or in this particular circumstance, is it possible that just wasn't possible, that the hatred was just too entrenched, that the Israelis were never going to win Palestinians over?
Well, I think it goes to the strategic objective. What is the end state you're trying to accomplish? And of course, in this case, Prime Minister Netanyahu had said over and over that, he was against the idea of a two-state solution. He had even talked openly about how he helped kill the idea of a two-state solution. And so the use of military force in a situation where you have no intention of allowing the people that live there to ever have their own state, but that they somehow are either going to be forced out of Gaza or forced to live under some sort of Israeli administration, you end up with very, very permissive rules of engagement, let's say. So I would always connect back, why are we there? What is the purpose of having military in there? And by the way, this was an entirely appropriate place for the Israeli Defense Force to go. But when you can step back from the actual fighting and think about how the rest of the world began to change its opinion towards Israel. Certainly UK, US, many other Western countries, Germany, have tended to be pro-Israeli or supportive of Israel for a variety of reasons. I think because of Israel's use of force in this case. And you could argue that pictures and numbers coming out of Gaza were not entirely accurate all the time. The fact is, the rest of the world perceived that Israel was using force excessively without regard for civilian casualties. Fair or not, that's the perception. And so the burden is on the Israeli government to prevent that perception.
But if we go back to what the apparent aim of these operations were, which was the defeat of Hamas, and obviously in the circumstances that was not at all an unreasonable ambition, was there another way to go about it? Was there a way that, for example, the US or UK militaries might have gone about it with, I don't know, smaller teams, precision strikes? How could the mission have looked different?
Well, this is a fair and good question, and I'm sure commanders and staff officers from the IDF could say, okay, how would you solve this? I mean, what are we supposed to do? And that is the challenge. The people that are insurgents and terrorist organizations, of course, they always hide amongst the population. We've known that for decades. And the UK has had great success in its past fighting against insurgents, but also not always. That is difficult when the insurgents are willing to allow the people around them to become casualties. I would just go back to what President Biden said when he showed up in Israel just in the very early days right after October the 7th. And he told Prime Minister Netanyahu, say, hey, look, you can count on the United States. We're going to support you. You have the right to defend yourself. What happened on October 7th was indescribably terrible. He said, but don't make the mistake that we did after 9/11 with a emotional reaction that clouded strategic thinking. And so, to be patient in such a situation when your entire nation is outraged is obviously very difficult. But you would have to go back to what's the end game? What do you want it to look like at the end of everything? And the idea that you could just eradicate millions of Palestinians from being there is not feasible, and the rest of the world is not going to sit by. So you're going to have to find another way to using working with other Arab countries, for example, in the region to choke off support for Hamas. But also the problem there has always been finding Palestinians an authority that was legitimate and also that could survive the first day or two after taking office. And that was always a problem as well. And the Israelis were right to point towards that.
Well, just finally then, and to go back to that idea that this has been an emotional, vindictive reaction versus what might have been, I guess, a more colder, patient, more logical approach. Is there ever, especially in terms of modern warfare, obviously for much of human history, warfare has been fought like this, entire populations, population centers, razed or displaced, etc., as certainly as recently as the Second World War. But in the current context, with the technology and the media environment we now have, is there ever any military logic to what you might think of as just purely punitive bombardment of civilians?
I see none. What Ukraine is doing to Russia right now, relentless attacks on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. Not only is that a legitimate target, but it also goes at Russia's ability to generate revenues it needs for its own to conduct the war. And it's also affecting gas supplies for Russians so that they're feeling the effects. That is entirely appropriate. But you can see, and I think this has been true in almost every case, I see zero utility in just killing civilians, thinking that somehow that's going to put pressure on the enemy to surrender.
Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of US Army Europe, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.